All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 25, Section 3, The Depths of the Great Depression. So during the Great Depression, it became a very real possibility for a good number of people to at least risk starvation. And this was not, and Americans were beginning to understand this was not sort of your typical everyday poverty which occurred. Americans made the distinction between what they called the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. The deserving poor were used to describe people who were poor because of no fault of their own. In other words, these were individuals who were poor because of outside circumstances. There was nothing necessarily wrong with them. They weren't lazy, they weren't undisciplined. They had all the characteristics that should make one successful and should make one at least have a decent standard of living. But the economic depression was so large that this sort of term fell out of favor, that Americans came to view the poor as being a result of circumstances and a lot less about their own individual fault. In other words, everybody was a deserving or considered to be deserving poor at this time, and so that sort of fell out of favor. And so to respond to the needs of food, you had a lot of bread lines and soup lines that opened up. This was a way for Americans to find nutrition when it was necessary. These were done mostly as charities. But it was a very difficult time for all Americans during this Depression era. The Depression hit Black Americans worse than white Americans. So when you compare, for example, Black unemployment versus white unemployment, that the unemployment rate for Blacks was much higher. So yes, everybody felt the hardship of the Depression, but some constituencies felt it more than others. This also led to an increase, the Depression did anyways, in racial violence. Typically, or we could look at, for example, lynchings, which were mob murders, typically of young Black men in the South. Lynchings increased during the Depression years, and racial tension in general increased. One notorious example was the Scottsboro Boys, which sort of illustrates the racial animosity, especially in the South. The Scottsboro Boys, who you see here, were nine young men or 9 boys who were accused of rape by a white woman. And they were found guilty and sentenced to death. Many believe that there was not adequate justice done in this particular case, especially the Communist Party and the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was established by W.E.B. Du Bois way back in the early 1900s. They raised money to retry this. And the case went through a series of appeals and retries and everything else, till eventually the Supreme Court stepped in and ruled that justice had not been given. So in this case, you have the Supreme Court coming in for the defense of the Scottsboro Boys and preventing this death penalty. And although the Scottsboro Boys did serve time in prison, none of them were sentenced to death, which was originally ruled by the local all-white jury in Alabama. So, the intervention by the Supreme Court here and the stance of the federal government when it came to issues of race in the South, the Scottsboro case is just the beginning of what is going to be kind of a decades-long story of increased federal intervention in the states, particularly in the South and the old Confederacy, to do justice. And the basis for which the Supreme Court ruled this off of was the 14th Amendment, which of course was one of those Reconstruction amendments. In addition to the racial disparities in the economic depression, you also had disparities between those who lived in the urban part of the country and the rural, and especially some of the environmental damage that was done during the Depression years. In the Midwest, you had an especially but not bizarre, but an especially unusual change in weather that only compounded the issue of the Depression for farmers, and that was the Dust Bowl. And you can start to see, these images here to get an idea of what the Dust Bowl was about. So farmers were hard hit by the Depression as well, perhaps more so than anybody else, you can make the argument. Some of this had to do with the crop price decline. As crops continued to decline in price, farmers found it increasingly difficult to sell them, but also because much of the land in the Midwest had been overproduced and overused. This created a depleted soil, and really sort of let the it left sort of the right conditions. If all the nutrients and all the moisture and stuff is sucked up out of the soil because of overproduction of farming and the overuse of land, well, that leaves a top layer of dusty soil that is just asking for kind of a windstorm to come through. And that's exactly what happened in the 1930s. You had an especially what we might call this an especially a dry wind weather event, we'll call it that, in which massive dust storms were created, not only causing problems for growing food, good luck growing food in a dust storm, but even caused so much dust to be in the air that they had names for sicknesses that people had from breathing in all the dust pneumonia they called it. And this was especially true in places like Oklahoma. And people who moved from Oklahoma became known as Okies. So Okies were, in some ways, we could say, refugees of the Dust Bowl. That things were so bad in Oklahoma that they simply moved out of there. And all the people who were moving at once were referred to as Okies. Many of them actually moved to the West, places like California. And all of this, the Depression era, began having its impact on culture. What was very big in the 1920s was this idea of rags to riches. I mean, this was also true in the Gilded Age. You had some post-war disillusionment, but generally speaking, the 1920s was the Roaring 20s, the Jazz Age. It was an age of prosperity. And it was an age in which, people believed that if you worked hard, you could make it, right? That, that being successful was only a matter of what you did as a person. That culture began to kind of fall out of favor a little bit. The stories of rags to riches from previous times became less popular, and more there was kind of a focus on, you might say more of the pessimistic side of things. The Grapes of Wrath, this was a book by John Steinbeck. It was about the Dust Bowl and how it hits a family in particularly hard. It's a Wonderful Life is a story about how a community saves a local bank from kind of the big robber baron sort of greedy industrial and banking and finance interests. So this was more about communal action rather than something like rags to riches. And probably the most popular form of culture and entertainment of the 1930s was escapism. And this was just, entertainment to escape the harsh reality. You could lose yourself for an hour or so and get away from the harsh world that, characterized the Great Depression years.